At my sister's baby shower, she laughed and asked if I was still single while my mother chimed in saying at least one daughter wasn't a total failure. I stayed quiet and sipped my water. Then the double doors swung open and a man arrived in a helicopter walked in with a child and announced he was my husband. The room went dead silent, and the look on my brother-in-law's face was worth every penny of the debt I was about to call in. My name is Audrey, and at 34 years old I learned that blood is not always thicker than water. Sometimes it is just toxic sludge you have to wade through to find your freedom. I spent a decade building a digital empire my family knows nothing about, letting them believe I was just a struggling graphic designer living paycheck to paycheck. Last weekend, that charade ended in the most spectacular way possible. If you have ever been the black sheep of your family, only to realize you were the only one with integrity, hit that like button and subscribe. You are going to want to hear how this unfolds. The rented mansion in the Hamptons was suffocatingly opulent. Crystal chandeliers vibrated with the bass of tasteful jazz music, and the smell of expensive lilies was almost enough to mask the stench of superficiality that filled the room. My sister Kylie sat on a velvet high-backed chair that looked more like a throne surrounded by a mountain of pastel-wrapped boxes. She was 29, glowing with pregnancy hormones, and an inflated sense of self-importance that had been nurtured by our mother since birth. I stood near the back of the room trying to blend into the cream-colored wallpaper. I had spent 3 months knitting a blanket for her baby. It was made of the softest merino wool in a gentle sage green, and every stitch contained a silent prayer for her child to turn out kinder than its parents. When Kylie finally reached for my gift, the room went quiet. She tore off the paper with aggressive speed, expecting something designer. When she pulled out the knitted blanket, her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a sneer that twisted her perfectly made-up face. She held the blanket up by one corner, as if it were a soiled rag, letting it dangle precariously over the expensive Persian rug. Her laugh was sharp and cruel, cutting through the ambient chatter. "Seriously, Audrey," she said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You are still this cheap, are you not? Dante just bought us a custom smart crib worth $5,000, and you think my son needs this scratchy dust rag?" She dropped it. She did not place it down, she let it fall to the floor and kicked it aside with her heel. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd of socialites and wealthy pretenders. My face burned not with shame, but with a cold, simmering rage. I walked forward silently and bent down to pick up the blanket, dusting off the invisible dirt. I did not look at her. I did not scream. I just folded it neatly, while my mother Beatrice watched from the front row, shaking her head with a look of theatrical disappointment. They had no idea that the woman picking up the rejected wool blanket could buy this entire property with a single wire transfer, but they were about to find out. Beatrice tapped her manicured fingernail against the microphone, sending a sharp screech of feedback through the room that silenced the few remaining whispers. She stood center stage, bathed in the warm glow of the crystal chandelier, looking every bit the matriarch of high society. She smoothed her silk dress and offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. Her gaze drifted over the guests before landing heavily on me, just as I finished folding the rejected blanket. "I just want to thank you all for coming to celebrate Kylie and Dante today," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It brings a mother such relief to know that at least one of her daughters understands the assignment of womanhood. We were so worried about the family legacy, but thank goodness Kylie found a man of status and is giving us an heir." She paused for effect, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable. "Unlike someone else we know." Heads turned in my direction. I felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes pinning me to the spot. My mother continued, her tone shifting from celebratory to a mock whisper that was clearly meant for the back row. "Poor Audrey. 34 years old and still trying to figure out her life. No husband, no prospects. And let us be honest, that biological clock is ticking louder than a bomb. It is truly a tragedy to see such wasted potential, but I suppose every family needs a cautionary tale." A few guests chuckled nervously while others looked at their shoes, but my mother beamed as if she had just delivered a compliment. The humiliation washed over me, cold and familiar. I had heard variations of this speech for years, but hearing it broadcasted to a room full of strangers was a new low. I clenched my jaw and turned toward the exit. I had tolerated enough. I was going to walk out that door, get in my car, and block their numbers forever. But before I could take 3 steps, Beatrice was in front of me, blocking my path with surprising speed. Her hand clamped around my wrist, her nails digging into my skin. "Where do you think you are going?" she hissed, dropping the public persona instantly. "You are not leaving yet. We are short on staff, and I paid good money for this venue. Since you could not afford a decent gift, the least you can do is make yourself useful." She signaled to a passing waiter who looked terrified and snatched a heavy silver tray loaded with champagne flutes from his hands. She shoved it into my chest, forcing me to grab it with both hands to keep the glasses from crashing to the floor. "Earn your dinner, Audrey," she whispered, her face inches from mine. "Go serve the guests. And try to smile. You look miserable and it is ruining the aesthetic." She gave me a final shove toward the crowd before turning back to the room with her plastic smile restored. I stood there holding the tray, my knuckles white against the silver handles. For a second I considered dropping it. I considered letting the expensive crystal shatter right there on the parquet floor. But I did not. I took a deep breath, straightened my spine, and walked into the crowd. I would play their game for exactly 10 more minutes. Because when the clock ran out, I was going to own every single person in this room. I navigated the crowded room like a ghost, carrying the heavy silver tray of champagne. My arms began to ache, but I kept my posture rigid. I was halfway to the kitchen when a hand shot out and grabbed my elbow, bringing me to an abrupt halt. It was Dante. He was surrounded by 3 other men in expensive suits holding tumblers of amber liquid. He looked me up and down with a smirk that made my skin crawl, adjusting his silk tie with a slow, deliberate motion. "Well, look at this," he announced to his circle, his voice booming with performative joviality. "Our very own Audrey finally making herself useful. I see Beatrice found a way to justify your attendance fee." The men chuckled, swirling their drinks. Dante leaned in closer, the smell of scotch and expensive cologne rolling off him in waves. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp leather wallet. With a flick of his wrist, he produced a $100 bill and dropped it onto my tray, right between 2 glasses of champagne. The wet condensation from the flutes soaked into the paper immediately. "We are out of ice over here," he said, pointing to his empty glass. "Run down to the corner store and grab a few bags. And keep the change. Do not look at me with those big sad eyes, Audrey. Consider it a tip. That is probably what you make in a whole week designing those little flyers, or whatever it is you do. Be grateful." I stared at the money. Ben Franklin stared back at me, damp and insulting. My fingers twitched. I wanted to throw the tray in his face. I wanted to tell him that the watch on his wrist was a fake replica I had spotted from across the room, and that his firm was currently under investigation by the SEC, thanks to an anonymous tip I had submitted last week. But I did not. I simply nodded. "You are too generous, Dante," I said, my voice flat. He turned his back to me, dismissing me as if I were furniture, and addressed his colleagues. "You have to be firm with people like her. It is just like that case I closed this morning. This single mother tried to sue my client for wrongful eviction just because the heating unit failed in winter. I told the judge, 'Look, Your Honor, society has winners, and society has parasites. If you cannot afford the rent, you do not get to complain about the cold.'" He took a sip of his drink, looking pleased with himself. "We crushed her, of course. Legal fees buried her before we even got to discovery. That is the problem with this country. Too many people think the world owes them a living just because they exist. They bleed the achievers dry." One of the associates laughed and clapped Dante on the back. "You are a shark, Dante. Remind me never to get on your bad side." Dante glanced back at me over his shoulder, his eyes cold and predatory. "Exactly. There are wolves and there are sheep, and sheep exist to be eaten. Now hurry up with that ice, Audrey. My scotch is getting warm." I walked away, the $100 bill still sticking to the tray. A cold smile touched my lips. He was right about one thing. There are wolves and there are sheep. But Dante had made a fatal error in judgment. He assumed that just because I was silent, I was the sheep. He had no idea that he had just handed lunch money to the butcher. I placed the tray down on a side table and checked my watch. The helicopter was 3 minutes out. It was time for the food chain to be rearranged. The vibration started before the sound did. I had not even reached the kitchen doors when the crystal glasses on my silver tray began to dance, clinking against each other with a frantic rhythm. The low thrumming noise grew rapidly into a deafening roar that shook the floorboards beneath my feet. Outside, the floor-to-ceiling French windows, the perfectly manicured lawn was suddenly whipped into a frenzy. Expensive floral arrangements were knocked over by the gale force wind as a sleek black helicopter descended right onto the center of the garden. The room erupted in gasps. Guests rushed to the windows, spilling their drinks. This was not a news chopper or a medical transport. It was a private Sikorsky, the kind of machine that screamed power and unlimited resources. The rotating blades slowly came to a halt, and the side door opened. The double doors to the banquet hall swung open with force. Two large men in dark suits entered first, scanning the room with professional indifference before stepping aside. Then Ethan walked in. For the last 5 years, my family had imagined my partner as some unemployed loser I was too embarrassed to introduce. They were not prepared for the man who stepped onto the parquet floor. Ethan looked like he owned the oxygen in the room. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, cut to perfection, hugging his broad shoulders. There was no tie, just a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a glimpse of tanned skin. Beside him, holding his hand firmly, was Noah. My stepson looked like a miniature runway model in a velvet blazer and pristine white sneakers, his dark hair styled perfectly. The 2 security guards my mother had hired explicitly to keep riffraff out did absolutely nothing. They were large men used to bullying waitstaff and photographers, but they froze in the presence of true authority. They instinctively stepped back, lowering their heads as Ethan passed them. They knew better than to obstruct a man who arrived by air. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum of shock. Dante had stopped midway through a sip of scotch, his glass hovering near his mouth. Beatrice was clutching her pearls, her eyes wide and unblinking. But Kylie could not stand the silence. She could not stand that for 5 seconds she was not the center of the universe. She struggled up from her velvet throne, her face flushing a deep, ugly shade of crimson. She waddled forward furiously, kicking aside the wrapping paper of her gifts. "Excuse me," she shrieked, her voice cracking with indignation. "Who the hell do you think you are? This is a private event for the elite. You cannot just barge in here like you own the place." She turned wildly to the frozen guards. "Security, why are you just standing there like idiots? Throw him out! Get this trespasser and his brat out of my party right now!" Ethan did not even blink. He did not look at Kylie. He did not acknowledge her screaming or her existence. He simply scanned the crowd, his steel-gray eyes sweeping over the frozen faces until they locked onto me. I was standing near the service entrance, still clutching the heavy tray of champagne like a maid. His jaw tightened visibly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as he began to walk toward me, the sound of his dress shoes echoing in the silent hall. Ethan moved through the room with the kind of effortless grace that only comes from absolute confidence. He did not even glance at Kylie, who was still standing there with her mouth open, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. To him, she was nothing more than an obstacle to be navigated around. The crowd parted for him instinctively, creating a wide path down the center of the parquet floor. I stood frozen near the kitchen doors, my heart hammering against my ribs as he closed the distance between us. He stopped inches from me and gently took the heavy silver tray from my trembling hands, placing it on a nearby table with a dismissive clatter. Then he cupped my face in his hands, ignoring the 100 people staring at us, and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. "I am sorry I am late, my love," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the silent room. The board meeting ran long, and Noah refused to leave the hangar until we had the package secured. You know how he gets when it concerns you. Before I could answer, a small blur of velvet and energy shot past Ethan's legs. Noah wrapped his arms around my waist, burying his face in my apron. "Mommy," he shouted, looking up at me with bright, excited eyes. "I told Daddy to buy the whole flower shop for you because I know you like the smell of lilies better than roses. Did he tell you? We brought everything." The word mommy hung in the air like a thunderclap. It bounced off the vaulted ceilings and echoed in the ears of every socialite and family member present. The ambient noise of the party, the clinking of forks, the polite whispers, the jazz music, all of it vanished instantly. The room did not just go quiet, it went dead. The guests looked from me, the woman they had just seen being treated like a servant, to the billionaire who was looking at me like I was the only precious thing in the world. My mother Beatrice was standing near the buffet table. Her face had gone completely slack, the mask of superior judgment she had worn for 30 years, slipping off to reveal pure, unadulterated shock. Her hand, which had been holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, went limp. The glass slipped from her fingers. It seemed to fall in slow motion, tumbling through the air before hitting the hardwood floor. The crash was explosive, shattering the silence, and sending shards of crystal and expensive wine spraying across the hem of her designer gown. She did not even flinch. She just stared at Ethan, and then at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and dawning realization. The narrative she had built about her disappointing failure of a daughter had just been obliterated in less than 60 seconds. The silence that had gripped the room was shattered by a sound so sharp and discordant it made several guests flinch. It was Kylie laughing. It started as a low scoff and quickly escalated into a high-pitched manic cackle that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She clutched her pregnant belly with one hand and pointed a trembling finger at Ethan with the other, tears of mirth streaming down her face. "Oh my God," she gasped, wiping her eyes. "You almost had me there for a second." "Truly. This is a masterclass in desperation, Audrey. I knew you were pathetic, but I did not realize you were psychotic." She turned to the crowd, waving her hands dismissively. "Everyone relax. Please do not tell me you actually bought this little performance. This is clearly a hired actor. Look at him. He is too perfect. Nobody looks like that in real life unless they are getting paid hourly to pretend." Kylie stepped closer to Ethan, her fear replaced by a renewed sense of superiority. She reached out as if to touch the lapel of his suit but stopped short, sneering. "Nice costume. Where did you rent it?" "The theater district." "And the kid? Did you audition him too?" "That is actually sick, Audrey. Renting a child to stage a fake family because you cannot accept that I won at life and you lost." The guests began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably. Kylie's determination to deny reality was so intense it was almost convincing. To them, it made more sense that the family disappointment had snapped and staged a hoax than the possibility that she had secretly married a titan of industry. "That is enough." Dante stepped forward, pushing past his wife. He did not look amused, he looked threatened. As a lawyer, he smelled a liability, and his instinct was to crush it with statutes and intimidation. He adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest, trying to physically match Ethan's stature. He failed miserably. "Listen to me, pal," Dante said, his voice dropping to what he thought was a menacing baritone. "I do not know what kind of scam you two are running, but you picked the wrong family to mess with. I am a senior partner at Davis and Moore. Impersonating a person of status to crash a private event is fraud. If you are here to solicit money or harass my guests, I will have you in cuffs before you can get back to your rental helicopter." Dante looked around the room, seeking validation from his wealthy peers. He wanted to be the hero who exposed the con artist. He turned back to Ethan, a smirk playing on his lips. "I will give you one chance to walk away without a criminal record," Dante continued, tapping his finger against Ethan's chest. "Admit you are an actor. Admit Audrey paid you. And then get the hell out of my house before I sue you for emotional distress and trespassing." Ethan looked down at the finger poking his chest. He did not move. He did not blink. He simply looked at Dante with the kind of bored curiosity a lion might have for a particularly noisy mosquito. The air around them grew heavy with impending violence, but Ethan remained perfectly still. He was letting them dig their hole deeper, and Dante just grabbed a shovel. Dante stepped forward, puffing his chest out in a display of territorial aggression that bordered on comical. He moved with the clumsy confidence of a man who believed his expensive suit was a suit of armor. He planted his feet firmly between us and the exit blocking Ethan's path with his shoulder, while his eyes darted around the room, ensuring his wealthy peers were watching him handle the situation. "Listen to me, pal," Dante sneered, invading Ethan's personal space. "You might have fooled the women with the helicopter stunt and the rented kid, but I know a con when I see one. Breaking and entering is a felony in this state. Impersonating a person of financial standing to commit fraud is another. I can have the sheriff here in 5 minutes and have you booked before the engine on that chopper cools down." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale scotch and arrogance. "So let's cut the act. Be a man for once in your life. How much is she paying you? 500? 1,000? I will double it right now if you admit to everyone in this room that Audrey hired you to crash my party." The room held its breath. Kylie had stopped screaming, waiting for the confession that would vindicate her. Beatrice was watching with her hands clasped, praying for her son-in-law to destroy this intruder. Ethan did not step back. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked down at Dante with an expression of mild distaste, as if he had stepped in something unpleasant on the sidewalk. He adjusted his cufflinks slowly, letting the silence stretch until Dante began to sweat under the intensity of his gaze. "You are Dante Reynolds, correct?" Ethan asked, his voice calm and level. Dante blinked, surprised that the stranger knew his name. "That is right, senior associate at Davis and Moore. And I am about to ruin your life." Ethan shook his head slightly, a small, cold smile playing on his lips. "Davis and Moore. That is the firm my holding company acquired 3 weeks ago to handle our low-level liability cases. I saw your name on the restructuring list this morning. You handle slip and fall cases and minor property disputes." Dante's face went pale. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogance evaporated instantly, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. "I have a strict policy," Ethan continued, his voice dropping an octave so only those close by could hear the steel in his tone. "I do not converse with low-level employees outside of business hours, especially ones who are currently trespassing on my property." Ethan brushed a piece of invisible lint off Dante's shoulder, dismissing him completely. "Now step aside. My wife is tired, and I believe you are currently standing in her living room." Dante stumbled back as if he had been physically shoved. He looked from Ethan to me, his eyes wide with confusion and panic. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that he could not find his footing. He wanted to scream that it was a lie, but the specific mention of the acquisition froze the words in his throat. He knew about the merger. It was confidential. Only the top partners knew. How did this stranger know? Ethan did not wait for an answer. He placed a protective hand on the small of my back and guided me forward, forcing Dante to scramble out of the way to avoid colliding with us. The humiliation was absolute. The predator had just realized he was standing in the cage with a much bigger beast. Ethan turned his back on the trembling lawyer and knelt down to Noah level. He nodded at the midnight blue velvet box in the boy hands. "Go ahead, buddy, give it to her." Noah thrust the box toward me, beaming with pride. It was not wrapped in pastel paper, like the mountain of gifts behind Kylie. It was heavy and substantial, stamped with gold lettering that I recognized immediately. It was the logo of the most prestigious real estate firm in Manhattan. My hands shook slightly as I lifted the lid. I expected jewelry, perhaps a necklace or a commemorative bracelet to mark the occasion. What I found inside was a single folded document printed on thick cream linen paper. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon, until they landed on the property address and the declared value. The penthouse suite at 157 West 57th Street, fully paid. Title transferred to Audrey and Ethan Vance. I gasped. This was not just an apartment. This was one of the most exclusive addresses in New York City, a residence worth more than this entire estate and everything inside it combined. The deed sat heavy in my hands, a tangible proof of a life I had built without their help or their approval. Dante, who was still hovering nearby, caught a glimpse of the letterhead. His eyes bulged. As a lawyer, he knew exactly what that document represented. He knew the zoning, he knew the square footage, and most importantly, he knew the price tag. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting under the heat of realization. But it was my mother whose reaction was the most terrifying. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the silence of shock, but the silence of calculation. I could practically hear the gears turning in Beatrice's head. The woman who had just moments ago called me a failure and forced me to serve drinks was now staring at the deed with hungry, dilated eyes. The smell of money was the only perfume she actually liked, and right now the air was thick with it. She moved faster than I thought possible in her heels. She navigated around the broken glass of her own champagne flute and approached us with a smile so wide it looked painful. Her posture transformed instantly from rigid judgment to fluid, welcoming warmth. She smoothed her dress and reached out a hand laden with rings, intending to rest it familiarly on Ethan's shoulder. "Oh, you naughty children," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial syrup. "Why did you keep this a secret from us? If I had known my Audrey had caught such a magnificent catch, we would have thrown a party for you instead. You really must forgive a mother worry. We just want the best for her, and clearly she has found it." She ignored me completely and focused her predatory gaze on Ethan. Her hand hovered inches from his expensive suit jacket. She was ready to rewrite history instantly, to secure her proximity to power. She was ready to pretend the last 10 years of neglect never happened just to get a foot in the door of that penthouse. It was a masterclass in opportunism, and it made my stomach turn. She truly believed that wealth erased sins. Beatrice's fingers were inches away from the lapel of Ethan's suit jacket when I finally snapped. The sheer audacity of her greed ignited a fire in my chest that burned away the last remnants of my childhood fear. I did not just step back. I slapped her hand away. The sound of skin striking skin was sharp and loud, echoing through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. "Do not touch him," I said, my voice trembling, not with fear, but with a lifetime of suppressed rage. 5 minutes ago, I was the disgrace of this family. I was the stain on your perfect reputation. Now that you smell money, you think you can play the doting mother. Do not insult my intelligence, Beatrice. You do not get to touch my husband. You do not even get to look at him. Beatrice recoiled, clutching her hand to her chest, as if I had burned her physically. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her eyes darting around the room, seeking sympathy from a crowd that was now watching her with open disdain. "But I am your mother," she sputtered, her voice cracking. "Audrey, how can you be so cruel in front of all these people?" Ethan stepped forward, placing his body between Beatrice and me like a shield. His presence was a wall of ice that froze her theatrics instantly. He did not shout. He did not need to. He spoke with the calm, absolute authority of a man who could buy and sell everyone in the room 10 times over. "You lost the right to that title a long time ago," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. "I did not come here to play happy families. I came here to rescue my wife from this nest of vipers. We are leaving. But before we go, there is a small administrative matter to settle." He pulled a sleek black phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen before turning his gaze to Dante, who was still cowering near the buffet table. "You mentioned earlier that this is a private event held at a rented estate, correct? Well, I found the architecture charming, so while my son was giving Audrey her gift, I had my assistant contact the owner. As of 10 minutes ago, the wire transfer cleared." Ethan paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I am the new owner of this property, and I have a very strict policy regarding trespassers." The color drained from Kylie's face. She looked around the lavishly decorated hall, the venue she had bragged about renting for thousands of dollars an hour. She realized with dawning horror that she was standing in her enemy living room. "You are lying!" she screeched, her voice shrill and desperate. "You cannot just buy a house in 10 minutes. That is impossible." "Everything is possible when you have liquidity," Ethan replied coldly. "The party is over. You and your guests have exactly 5 minutes to remove yourselves and your tacky decorations from my property. Anyone remaining after that will be escorted out by the local police for trespassing. And Dante, I believe you know that an arrest record would be quite damaging to your already failing legal career." Ethan checked his watch. 4 minutes and 50 seconds. I suggest you start running. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then panic set in. The socialites who had laughed at me earlier began scrambling for their purses and coats, terrified of being associated with a police incident. The room devolved into chaos. I stood in the circle of Ethan's arm watching the people who had tormented me for years scatter like cockroaches when the lights turn on. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. The exodus of the guests was humiliating but orderly, until Kylie decided to detonate her final nuclear option. She realized she was losing the audience. The spotlight had shifted entirely to me, and she would burn the building down before she let that happen. Suddenly, a shrill scream pierced the air, stopping the fleeing socialites in their tracks. Kylie doubled over, clutching her stomach with theatrical desperation, her face contorted in a mask of practiced agony. "My baby," she wailed, sinking to her knees on the hardwood floor in a heap of expensive silk. "Oh God, the pain. You are killing him, Audrey. You and your stress are killing my son." The room gasped. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. Dante immediately jumped into the scene, dropping to his knees beside her and shouting for someone to call an ambulance, though I noticed he made no move to check her pulse or comfort her. He simply looked up at the crowd, his eyes gleaming with the opportunity to turn the narrative around. "Look what you have done," Dante bellowed, pointing an accusing finger at Ethan. "You come here with your threats and your intimidation tactics, and you induce labor in a pregnant woman. If anything happens to my son, I will sue you for everything you are worth." Kylie gripped Dante's arm, pulling herself up just enough to launch her venom directly at me. Her tears were flowing freely now, mixed with running mascara, but her eyes remained cold and calculating. "She is doing this on purpose," Kylie sobbed, addressing the room at large. "She has always been jealous of me. She cannot have her own family, so she is trying to destroy mine. Look at her standing there with that child." She pointed a trembling finger at Noah, who shrank back against Ethan's leg, confused by the sudden screaming. "We all know the truth, Audrey," Kylie spat. "That boy is nothing but a prop. He is some illegitimate child you dragged here to play house. You are just a wicked stepmother preying on a wealthy man to steal an inheritance that does not belong to you. You are a gold digger, Audrey. You found a man with a checkbook and a motherless child, and you clawed your way in like the parasite you are." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and raw. The guests who had been rushing to leave now lingered near the doors, whispering furiously. The narrative of the poor pregnant woman being bullied by her wealthy, estranged sister was juicy enough to make them pause. "You are not a mother," Kylie screamed, her voice cracking. "You are just a glorified nanny with a marriage license. You do not know what it means to carry a life. You are empty inside, and you are trying to fill that void with my husband's money and someone else's kid." I watched her writhe on the floor, sobbing about her stomach pains while simultaneously having enough breath to scream insults. I remembered when we were 12 and she faked a seizure to get out of a math test she had not studied for. I remembered when she faked a twisted ankle to make our father carry her up the stairs while I hauled the luggage. This was her oldest trick, weaponized victimhood. But looking at Noah's face, seeing the hurt in his innocent eyes as she called him illegitimate, something inside me hardened into diamond. She had crossed the final line. There was no coming back from this. The helicopter ride back to Manhattan should have been a victory lap. Below us, the city lights glittered like scattered diamonds, but the device in my hand was vibrating with the intensity of a swarm of angry hornets. We had not even landed before Dante's retaliation began. He did not go home to comfort his hysterical wife. He went straight to war, using the only weapon he had left, which was his connection to the gutter press. My phone screen lit up with a notification from a major gossip column. The headline was written in bold, aggressive red letters that made my stomach turn. "Cinderella's sister," or "Ruthless gold digger." Inside the article was a masterpiece of creative fiction. Dante had spun the narrative so fast it was almost impressive. The story claimed that I had abandoned my high-risk pregnant sister in a moment of medical crisis to jet off with a billionaire sugar daddy. It painted me as a woman who had turned her back on her humble roots to chase status, leaving her family destitute and heartbroken. They used a photo of Kylie crying outside the mansion. It was cropped carefully to exclude her luxury SUV and her diamond earrings, making her look like a helpless victim cast out onto the cold streets. The caption read, "Sister left in tears as sibling chooses luxury over loyalty." Dante was quoted as an anonymous close family friend expressing deep concern for my mental state, suggesting I had been brainwashed by a controlling partner. I scrolled down to the comments section, which was my first mistake. The internet mob had already assembled. Strangers who knew nothing about my life were calling me a parasite, a narcissist, and worse. They accused me of buying a child affection and marrying for money. Some were even tagging Ethan companies demanding a boycott. Dante knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he could not beat Ethan in a courtroom, so he decided to try and destroy us in the court of public opinion. He wanted to shame me into submission, hoping I would write a check just to make the bad press go away. Ethan saw the reflection of the screen in the window. He reached over and gently took the phone from my hand, turning it off and sliding it into his pocket. "Do not give them your energy, Audrey," he said, his voice cutting through the noise in my head. "This is the desperation of a drowning man. He thinks if he thrashes hard enough, someone will save him." I looked at him and then at Noah, who was asleep in the seat across from us, clutching a toy plane. Dante had targeted everyone I loved. He had weaponized my silence and twisted my patience into a weakness. I realized then that taking the high road does not work when you are dealing with people who live in the gutter. If Dante wanted a media war, I would not just participate. I would end it. He thought he was destroying my reputation, but he had just handed me the evidence I needed to destroy his career. By the time we landed at the private helipad on the west side, the world had already decided I was a villain. I expected privacy, but Dante had leaked our location. A swarm of paparazzi was waiting at the gates, their cameras flashing like strobe lights in the darkness. They screamed questions that were really accusations, asking how much I charged for my services and if I felt guilty about stressing out a pregnant woman. Ethan's security team formed a human wall to get us into the waiting SUV, but the damage was done. Every flash of a camera felt like a physical blow. Inside the car, the silence was suffocating. My phone began to ring again. It was not a blocked number this time. It was Mom. For a split second, a foolish, childish part of me thought she was calling to apologize. I thought maybe seeing her daughter being torn apart by wolves on the internet had finally awakened a maternal instinct. I picked up. That was a mistake. Beatrice's voice was not soothing. It was frantic, but not with worry. It was the manic energy of someone who had just realized they were holding a winning lottery ticket. "Audrey, darling," she said, breathless. "Have you seen the news? It is terrible, just terrible. The reporters are camped out on my lawn. They want a statement. They are offering me $50,000 for an exclusive interview about your childhood." I stared at the city blurring past the window. "What do you want, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice hollow. "I want to protect you." "Of course," she said quickly, too quickly. "But you know how expensive legal fees are, darling, and with the house being sold out from under us, we are in a very precarious position. If I go on television and tell them the truth that you were always a difficult child who resented Kylie's success, well, that would ruin you completely, would it not? But if I were to refuse the interview, tell them Dante is lying, well, I would need to be compensated for that lost opportunity." I felt a cold numbness spread through my chest. "You are blackmailing me," I stated. "I am negotiating." Beatrice corrected, her tone hardening. "I am offering you a lifeline. Transfer $1 million to my account by tomorrow morning. Call it a severance package for all the years I spent raising you. If the money is not there, I have a slot booked on the morning show at 9. And Audrey, trust me when I say I will cry on cue. I will make the world hate you so much you will not be able to show your face in a grocery store, let alone a boardroom." She hung up before I could answer. I looked at the phone in my hand. The screen went black, reflecting my own face back at me. There were no tears left. The last thread of attachment I had to the woman who gave birth to me had just snapped. She wanted $1 million to keep her mouth shut. What she did not realize was that her silence was not worth a penny, but her greed was about to cost her everything. While the world outside was burning with rumors and paparazzi were fighting for position on my mother lawn, I sat in the climate-controlled silence of a 42nd floor conference room in Midtown. My mother expected me to be crying in a bathroom somewhere, and Dante expected me to be writing a press release begging for mercy. They were both wrong. I was not reacting. I was reloading. Across the mahogany table sat Marcus, my attorney, who had been managing my private blind trust for a decade. He slid a thick leather-bound portfolio across the polished wood surface. The portfolio contained the one secret that would turn my family blood cold. For 5 years, Dante had been strutting around the headquarters of Reynolds Logistics, acting like he was the king of the castle. He fired people who looked at him wrong and leased company cars he could not afford. He called himself the CEO, but he had forgotten to check who actually owned the chair he sat in. When my father died, the company was almost bankrupt. I could not watch his legacy crumble, so I stepped in. I bought 51% of the voting shares through a shell corporation called Janus Ventures. To Dante, Janus Ventures was just a silent partner on a piece of paper, a faceless entity that signed checks and stayed out of his way. He had no idea that the silent partner was the sister-in-law he had just mocked for being poor. He had no idea that every time he insulted me at a family dinner, he was insulting his boss. Marcus opened the file, revealing the quarterly reports. "It is worse than we thought, Audrey," he said, tapping a column of red ink. "Dante has leveraged the company assets to cover his personal debts. He is moving money around to hide the losses, but the walls are closing in. He is treating the company accounts like his personal piggy bank. Technically, as the majority shareholder, you could fire him for cause effective immediately." I looked at the numbers. It was tempting to end it right now, to make one phone call and have security escort him out of the building. But that was too easy. Dante wanted a war, so I was going to give him one. I did not want to just fire him. I wanted to expose him. I wanted every board member, every employee, and every shareholder to see exactly who he was before I kicked him into the street. I closed the folder and looked out the window at the skyline. "Do not fire him yet, Marcus," I said. "Let him feel safe for one more day. Let him think he has won the media war. Because when I pull the rug out from under him, I want him to be standing as tall as possible so the fall breaks every bone in his career. Prepare the documents for a hostile board takeover, and Marcus, get the forensic accountants ready. I want to know where every single cent went." Marcus sat across from me, his finger hovering over the enter key of his laptop. He looked at me with a mixture of professional concern and personal satisfaction, waiting for the final command. "Are you sure you want to proceed, Audrey?" he asked, his voice low. "Once we suspend the transfer, the account will be flagged immediately for review. The assets will be frozen, and any pending transactions will bounce. There is no undoing this without a significant amount of paperwork." I did not blink. For 10 years, I had funneled $5,000 a month into a shell account I called the Family Preservation Fund. My mother believed it was a residual pension from my late father's estate, or perhaps some wise investment he had made before he passed. She never questioned why it adjusted for inflation, or why it never ran out. She never asked where the money came from, because she believed she was entitled to it by divine right. She just spent it. She used my hard-earned money to buy the clothes she wore to insult me, and the dinners where she told me I was worthless. "Do it," I said coldly. "Cut her off." Uptown, in a marble-floored boutique on Fifth Avenue, Beatrice was currently soothing her bruised ego the only way she knew how, by spending money she did not earn. She stood at the counter holding a limited-edition handbag made of ostrich leather, worth more than most people's car. She was loud, making sure everyone in the store knew she was someone of importance, attempting to project an image of unbothered wealth despite the media storm brewing outside her home. "I will take it," she announced, throwing her platinum credit card onto the glass counter with a dismissive clatter. "And do not bother wrapping it. I want to wear it out immediately. It goes with my shoes." The sales assistant, a young woman who looked exhausted, forced a polite smile and inserted the chip. The machine let out a harsh mechanical buzz. The assistant frowned and tried again. Beatrice tapped her foot impatiently, checking her reflection in the mirror. "Hurry up," she snapped. "I have a lunch reservation at Le Bernardin in 20 minutes, and I do not like to be kept waiting." The assistant looked up, her face flushing pink. "I am so sorry, Mom, but the card has been declined." The silence that followed was heavy. Beatrice laughed a sharp, incredulous bark that made the security guard look over. "Do not be ridiculous," she spat. "That is a platinum card with an unlimited limit. Run it again and check your machine. It is obviously broken, or perhaps your internet connection is as cheap as your service." The girl ran it again. Declined. She tried the magnetic strip. Declined. Beatrice's face began to mottle with rage. She dug into her purse and pulled out her backup card, a Visa Black she reserved for emergencies. "Try this one," she hissed, shoving it at the girl. "And when I speak to your manager about this embarrassment, you will be looking for a new job by the end of the day." The assistant swiped the black card. The machine buzzed again. The digital readout was unforgiving. "Transaction not authorized. Please contact issuer." Beatrice snatched her cards back, her hands trembling with a mix of fury and rising panic. She pulled out her phone and dialed the private banking line, putting it on speakerphone, unable to contain her rage. "I want to know why my cards are not working," she screamed the moment the operator answered. "I am standing in a store and you are humiliating me. Fix it now." The operator's voice was calm and professional, amplified for the whole store to hear. "Ma'am, I see here that the primary funding source for these accounts, labeled Family Preservation Trust, has issued a stop payment order. All associated lines of credit have been frozen pending a fraud investigation initiated by the donor." Beatrice froze. The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the glass counter. She had not just lost her purchasing power. She had just realized that the invisible safety net she had danced on for a decade had been pulled away, and she was falling into the abyss. The fluorescent lights in the executive office of Reynolds Logistics seemed to hum with an accusing frequency. Dante sat alone at the mahogany desk that used to belong to Audrey's father, surrounded by stacks of financial ledgers. His silk tie was loosened and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The forensic audit Audrey had threatened was not just a bluff. It was a death sentence. Dante stared at the numbers in front of him. For 3 years, he had been siphoning company funds to cover his online gambling debts and to maintain a lifestyle he could not actually afford. He had hidden the losses in complex vendor accounts and deferred maintenance costs, but the house of cards was collapsing. The operating account was empty. Payroll was due in 3 days, and there was zero liquidity. When the forensic accountants dug into the general ledger, they would not find simple mismanagement. They would find grand larceny. He needed money. He needed a massive injection of cash to backfill the accounts before the auditors reached the bottom of the pile. He needed a miracle or a victim. His eyes drifted to the newspaper on his desk, where a photo of Ethan Vance exiting the helicopter was plastered on the front page. The man was worth billions, and legally, he was now family. A twisted, desperate plan began to form in Dante's mind. He grabbed his briefcase and drove to Beatrice's house, where Kylie was currently staying, claiming she was too traumatized to return to their own home. He found his wife lying on the sofa, surrounded by tissues, scrolling through hate comments about Audrey on her phone. "We have them," Kylie Dante announced, pacing the living room with manic energy. "I spent all night looking at the statutes. We can sue her." Kylie looked up, sniffing. "Sue her for what, Dante?" "For hurting my feelings. That does not pay the bills." "For fraud and breach of familial duty," Dante lied, smooth and convincing. He sat down beside her, taking her hand. "Listen to me. Audrey has been hiding assets for years. That trust fund she used to pay your mother bills proves she had wealth she did not disclose during the probate of your father's estate. By hiding that money, she denied you your fair share of the family capital." He watched Kylie's face. He could see the greed overriding the logic. But that is not all. Dante continued, pressing his advantage. By supporting Beatrice for a decade, she established a legal precedent of care. It is called the doctrine of detrimental reliance. We can argue that by cutting off that support, suddenly she is causing undue hardship to a dependent family member. And since she is married to Ethan Vance, we can go after the marital assets to satisfy that obligation. It was a tenuous legal argument at best, a complete fabrication at worst. But Dante knew he did not need to win in court. He just needed to file the lawsuit, create a media circus, and force Ethan to write a settlement check to make them go away. He needed $5 million to stay out of prison, and he was willing to burn his wife's sister to get it. "We go for half," Dante whispered. We sue for half of her marital assets. We argue that she built her company using family resources she stole from you. Kylie's eyes widened. She sat up, the tears vanishing instantly. You mean we could get the penthouse? Dante smirked. We can get everything, babe. We just have to hit her hard and fast. Sign the power of attorney, Kylie. Let me go get what belongs to us. The conference room at the law firm was cold and sterile, designed to intimidate anyone who could not afford the hourly rate of the partners whose names adorn the glass doors. Marcus sat to my left, silent and observant, while I sat with my hands folded on the polished mahogany table. We were waiting for the circus to arrive, and true to form, they did not just enter the room, they made an entrance. Dante walked in first, pushing the heavy glass door open with a flourish. He was wearing a navy pinstripe suit that I knew he had charged to the company expense account. Behind him waddled Kylie, clutching her lower back with one hand and a bottle of expensive mineral water with the other. She did not look at me. She dropped into the leather chair opposite mine, letting out a dramatic sigh, as if the simple act of sitting down was a heroic feat of endurance. Dante did not sit. He paced the length of the room, energizing the space with his toxic confidence. He looked at Marcus with a sneer of professional discourtesy before turning his gaze to me. I am glad you came to your senses, Audrey. Dante began, his voice booming in the quiet room. We do not want to do this the hard way. Nobody wants to see their sister dragged through a messy litigation, especially in her delicate condition. But you have left us no choice. You have been hiding assets and defrauding the family estate for years. He stopped pacing and leaned his knuckles on the table, looming over me. But we are willing to be generous. We are willing to settle this quietly, provided you agree to the terms of the true last will and testament of your father. Marcus raised an eyebrow. The will was probated 5 years ago, he said calmly. The estate was settled. That was the initial will, Dante corrected, flashing a predatory smile. But we found a codicil, a later amendment that was filed in a separate safe deposit box, which we only recently discovered. It seems the old man had very specific wishes regarding the family legacy. Dante reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick document. The paper looked aged, the edges slightly yellowed. He slid it across the table with the theatrical flair of a magician revealing a winning card. Read it, he commanded, pointing to a highlighted paragraph on the 3rd page. Article 4, subsection B. I looked down at the document. The font was an old typewriter style designed to look authentic. My eyes scanned the legal jargon until I reached the highlighted text. It read, in the event of my passing, the entirety of the family commercial holdings and liquid assets shall be held in trust until the birth of the first male heir. Upon such birth, full ownership shall transfer to the daughter who provides said grandson to carry on the bloodline. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a forgery, of course. My father was a modern man who cared about competence, not gender. But the signature at the bottom was terrifyingly accurate. Dante had not just typed up a lie, he had crafted a felony. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew Kylie was carrying a boy because he believed her lie. He had constructed a document that specifically disenfranchised me and handed everything to his wife based on biology alone. It is clear as day, Dante said, settling into his chair and crossing his arms. Kylie is having a son. You have no children. Therefore, by the express wishes of your late father, the company and all assets derived from it belong to her. That includes the seed money you used to start your little venture. We are taking it all, Audrey. The company, the profits, and yes, even that penthouse. Because technically, it was bought with stolen inheritance. Kylie rubbed her belly, smirking at the table. Daddy always did want a grandson, she whispered loud enough for me to hear. I am just fulfilling his last wish. I looked from the fake document to Dante's smug face. He thought he had checkmated me. He thought this piece of paper was his golden ticket. He had no idea that he had just handed me the physical evidence of a crime that would put him behind bars for a decade. I did not argue. I did not scream that it was fake. I simply signaled Marcus to take a copy. The trap was set. Marcus requested a 20-minute recess to review the authenticity of the document Dante had slapped onto the table. It was a stalling tactic, but we needed to regroup. Dante and Kylie strutted out of the conference room looking like they had already won the lottery, leaving us alone in the sudden silence. My head was spinning. If that document was accepted by a court even temporarily, they could tie up my assets for years. I rubbed my temples, trying to find a loophole in the trap they had set. That was when Noah tugged on the sleeve of my blazer. I had almost forgotten he was there, playing quietly with his tablet in the corner. He had asked to go to the restroom a few minutes before the recess began, and had just returned looking unusually serious for a 5-year-old. He climbed onto the chair beside me and leaned in close, cupping his hands around my ear as if sharing a state secret. "Mommy?" he whispered, his eyes wide and earnest. "That lady is a liar." I frowned slightly, stroking his hair. "Which lady, Noah?" "The loud one," he said, pointing toward the door where Kylie had exited. "The one who yelled at you at the party." I was in the bathroom stall playing my game and she came in to talk on her phone. She did not know I was there. She was crying and talking to someone named Dr. Evans. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at Marcus, who had stopped typing and was now watching Noah with intense interest. "What did she say?" "Noah," I asked, keeping my voice calm. "She said she knows the baby is a girl." Noah recited, his memory sharp and unclouded by adult nuances. "She said, I know the test said female, but you have to change the paper. She said her husband will kill her if he finds out, and she needs the paper to say boy so she can get the money." The air in the room seemed to vanish. I looked at Marcus and saw the same shock reflected in his eyes. The entire premise of Dante claimed the very foundation of this forged will, and his aggressive lawsuit rested on the condition of a male heir. Kylie wasn't just lying to me, she was lying to Dante. She was so terrified of his ambition and greed that she was willing to fabricate a medical reality to keep him happy. Noah continued, unaware that he had just handed me a nuclear weapon. Then she washed her face and practiced smiling in the mirror. She said, "Just hold on until the check clears, then I will say the doctors made a mistake." I pulled Noah into a hug, kissing the top of his head. "You are a very brave boy, Noah," I whispered. "You just saved us." I looked at the forged will on the table. It was no longer a threat. It was a trap, but not for me. It was a trap for Dante. He had built his entire strategy on a lie his wife was telling him. If I revealed the truth now, the lawsuit would collapse. But a colder, sharper plan began to form in my mind. Why stop the enemy when they are running toward a cliff? If Dante wanted to present this will to a judge based on the promise of a grandson, I was going to let him. I would let him perjure himself. I would let him stake his entire career and reputation on a baby that did not exist. And when the truth came out, he would not just lose the case. He would lose his license, his marriage, and his freedom. Marcus saw the look on my face. He closed his laptop and sat back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Do we tell them?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. We let them think they have won. We let them take this all the way to court. I want Dante to say it on the record. I want him to swear under oath that he is expecting a son. Let them dig their grave a little deeper, Marcus. I want to make sure they can never climb out." Marcus managed to stall the proceedings for 48 hours, claiming we needed time to authenticate the age of the paper used for the codicil. It was a thin excuse, but it gave me exactly the window I needed. I did not go home to rest. I went straight to the offices of Sterling Intelligence, a private investigation firm that specialized in corporate espionage and high-stakes divorce. I handed the lead investigator a blank check and a single instruction. I told him to tear Dante's life apart and bring me the pieces. 24 hours later, a courier delivered a heavy manila envelope to my penthouse. I sat on my velvet sofa with a glass of wine and opened it. What I found inside was not just evidence of theft. It was a portrait of a man completely out of control. The forensic accountant had traced the missing company funds immediately. Dante was not just bad at math, he was arrogant. He had set up a shell company called Zenith Consulting, which billed Reynolds Logistics $20,000 a month for advisory services that never happened. But the money trail did not stop at Zenith Consulting. From there, the funds were funneled into a personal account that paid the rent on a luxury studio apartment in the Lower East Side. I flipped to the next page and found the surveillance photos. They were high resolution and undeniable. There was Dante entering the building at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday when he was supposed to be in court, and there was the woman waiting for him. She was young, barely 22, and I recognized her immediately as the former receptionist at his law firm, who had been fired for incompetence last year. The investigator had done his job thoroughly. There were receipts for dinners at Nobu, receipts for diamond earrings that Kylie definitely did not own, and even a receipt for a tropical vacation booked for next month under a fake name. The dates for the trip coincided perfectly with Kylie's due date. While his wife was scheduled to be giving birth to the heir he so desperately wanted, Dante was planning to be sipping Mai Tais on a beach with his mistress. Marcus sat across from me, reviewing the file, his face grim. "This is enough to bury him, Audrey," he said. "We can send this to Kylie right now. She will drop the lawsuit and file for divorce before the sun comes up." I closed the file and took a sip of wine. "No," I said, my voice steady. "If we show this to Kylie now, she becomes the victim. She will cry and the world will feel sorry for her. She will say she was manipulated by a bad man. I do not want her to have that out." I looked at the photo of Dante kissing his mistress. "We wait," I commanded. "We let them walk into that courtroom together. We let them present a united front. I want Dante to testify about his moral character. I want him to look the judge in the eye and talk about family values. And then when he has lied under oath and committed perjury, I will introduce the judge to his girlfriend. We are not just winning a lawsuit, Marcus. We are executing a judgment." The VIP suite at Mount Sinai looked less like a medical facility and more like a carefully constructed stage set. Kylie lay in the center of the room, propped up against a mountain of pillows, wearing a silk robe she had packed specifically for this performance. She had touched up her makeup, ensuring her skin looked pale but flawless, and her hand rested protectively over her stomach in a pose that screamed maternal anguish. Outside the door, private security guards hired by Dante kept the press at bay, while simultaneously leaking updates about her critical condition to anyone who would listen. Inside the room, Beatrice was the director of photography. She stood at the foot of the bed, holding her phone steady, with a portable ring light clipped to the top. She was live streaming to 50,000 viewers, narrating the scene with a voice that cracked perfectly on cue. "Look at what she has done," Beatrice sobbed into the camera lens, zooming in on Kylie's face. "My poor daughter is fighting for the life of her child because her own sister threatened her." "Audrey, if you are watching this, I hope your money keeps you warm at night because you have frozen your heart." I watched the broadcast from the safety of my office, but the distance did nothing to dampen the rage boiling in my blood. Beatrice was weaponizing a medical emergency that did not exist. The comments section on the video was scrolling so fast it was a blur of hatred. Strangers were calling for my arrest. They were doxing my old addresses and sending death threats to my inbox. But the damage did not stop at my personal reputation. The mob had found a bigger target. Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to me, watching the city skyline. In his hand, a tablet displayed the real-time stock ticker for Vance Industries. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw tension in the set of his shoulders. The hashtag boycott Vance was trending #1 globally. The narrative that the CEO wife was an abuser who endangered pregnant women had spooked the retail investors. The stock had dipped 3% in an hour, erasing millions of dollars in market capitalization. "The board is calling for an emergency meeting," Ethan said, his voice calm but tight. "They are worried about the optics. They want me to issue a statement distancing the company from your family legal disputes." I felt a wave of guilt crash over me. This was exactly what Dante wanted. He knew he could not beat us in court, so he was trying to bleed us dry in the market. He was betting that Ethan would cut a check for $5 million just to stop the stock from sliding further. It was a classic extortion tactic wrapped in the guise of a family tragedy. "Do not issue the statement," I said, standing up. "If we apologize, we look guilty. If we settle, we admit fault. Dante thinks he is winning because he controls the camera right now. But he forgets that every hospital has its own cameras." I picked up my phone and dialed the private investigator. I need the security footage from the hospital parking garage, I said. Specifically from 2 hours ago. I want the video of the dying woman stopping at the gift shop to buy a fashion magazine and a candy bar before she checked herself into the emergency room. Ethan turned from the window, a slow smile breaking the tension on his face. He understood. We were going to let the stock dip for one more day. We were going to let them think they had us cornered. Because the higher the price of the stock bounced back after the truth came out, the richer we would all become. Ethan placed his hand on the intercom button on his desk. His knuckles were white with suppressed rage. He was ready to unleash the full force of his legal team, which was effectively an army in suits. He turned to me, his eyes blazing with the protective instinct of a predator whose territory had been breached. "I am done playing games, Audrey," he said, his voice low and vibrating with intensity. "Dante is attacking my family and my shareholders. I can have him disbarred by noon and in a holding cell by dinner. I will release the files on his embezzlement and crush him before he even knows what hit him." It was a tempting offer. It would be easy to let my husband wave his hand and make the monsters disappear. It would be easy to retreat into the safety of his billions and let him fight my battles. But easy was not what I wanted. I wanted justice. And justice required precision, not just brute force. I reached out and covered his hand with mine, pressing down firmly until he released the button. "No, Ethan." I said, my voice steady and cold. "Put the phone down." He looked at me, surprised by the command in my tone. "Audrey, look at the stock ticker. They are bleeding us." "Let them bleed us," I replied, standing up and walking to the center of the room. I smoothed my blazer and looked him directly in the eye. "If you destroy him now, he becomes a martyr. He becomes the little guy crushed by the corporate giant. The narrative remains that I am the villain who hid behind her rich husband. I do not want him to be crushed by you, Ethan. I want him to destroy himself." I began to pace the room, laying out the strategy that had formed in my mind. Dante is greedy, and greed makes people stupid. Right now he thinks he has leverage. He thinks the bad press is hurting us enough to force a settlement. We need to feed that delusion. We need to make him think we are desperate. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from anger to intrigue. He was seeing the woman who built a company from nothing, the woman he fell in love with. I continued, my voice sharpening. "We are going to agree to meet them. We are going to look tired and defeated, and we are going to offer them a deal. We will offer to transfer the shares of the family company to Dante and Kylie, just like they asked." "But Audrey, that is your legacy," Ethan argued. "It is a shell," I corrected. "It is a debt trap. The company is hemorrhaging money. The only thing keeping it afloat was my anonymous cash injections, which I stopped yesterday. Without my capital, that company is a sinking ship with $10 million in liabilities. If Dante signs the transfer papers, he assumes the debt. He thinks he is stealing a kingdom, but I am handing him a grenade with the pin pulled out." Ethan stared at me for a long moment, and then a slow, dark smile spread across his face. He stood up and walked over to me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "Remind me never to get on your bad side, Mrs. Vance." I looked up at him, my eyes clear and focused. "This is my war, Ethan. I want them to sign those papers thinking they have won. I want to see the look on their faces when they realize they just signed away their lives. Call them. Tell them we surrender. Tell them we are ready to sign." The conference room at the law firm was freezing, but I suspected the temperature was a psychological tactic rather than a mechanical failure. I sat across from Dante and Kylie, wearing large dark sunglasses. To them, I looked like a woman hiding the ravages of a sleepless night spent crying over bad press. In reality, I was hiding the fact that my eyes were dry and my gaze was lethal. On the table between us sat a stack of documents thick enough to be a novel. Dante was practically vibrating with adrenaline. He paced behind Kylie's chair, looking at the papers with the hunger of a starving wolf staring at a carcass. He believed his media smear campaign had broken me. He believed that the dip in Ethan Company stock had forced my hand. He was right about the pressure, but wrong about the outcome. He thought he was accepting a surrender, but he was actually signing a suicide note. "I am glad you finally decided to be reasonable," Audrey, Dante said, stopping his pacing to lean over the table. His voice was dripping with condescension. We did not want to ruin you. We just wanted what was fair. The family legacy belongs to the family, not to some corporate conglomerate you married into. I did not trust myself to speak too much, so I kept my voice barely above a whisper. Just make it stop, Dante. I cannot take the cameras outside my house anymore. I cannot take the death threats. You win. I signaled Marcus to slide the documents forward. This is the transfer agreement. It grants you and Kylie 100% ownership of Reynolds Logistics. It includes all physical assets, the brand rights, and full operational control. Once you sign this, I am out. I wash my hands of the company and the family. Kylie reached for the papers, her hand trembling with greed. She did not look at the clauses. She did not look at the liabilities section. She only saw the title of CEO and the imaginary millions she thought came with it. She looked at Dante, her eyes wide. We did it. We actually did it. Dante snatched the pen from the table. He was so eager to claim his prize that he did not even glance at Marcus, who was sitting with the stillness of a statue. A competent lawyer would have read the fine print. A smart man would have asked why I was giving up a controlling stake so easily, but Dante was neither competent nor smart. He was just greedy, and greed is a blinder that blocks out all warning signs. I just need to know one thing, I said, pausing before he touched the pen to paper. If you take the company, you take everything right. The history, the future, all of it. Everything, Dante confirmed with a smirk. Every single thing. He pressed the pen to the signature line. The scratching sound of the nib against the paper seemed deafening in the quiet room. He signed his name with a flourish, underlining it twice, as if to emphasize his victory. Then he slid the papers to Kylie, who signed below him without hesitation. I watched the ink dry. I watched them high-five each other. I watched Dante pour a glass of water and raise it in a mock toast to me. He had no idea that he had just assumed $10 million in debt. He had no idea that by signing that document, he had personally guaranteed every loan I had stopped paying yesterday. He thought he had just become a tycoon. In reality, he had just become the poorest man in the room. Done. Dante announced, slamming the folder shut. Now get out of my building. And Audrey, do not expect an invite to the christening. I stood up slowly, adjusting my sunglasses. I walked to the door, my heels clicking on the marble floor. I did not look back. I did not need to. I knew exactly what was coming next, and I wanted to be far away when the bomb went off. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, leaving Dante and Kylie alone in the conference room with Marcus. I did not need to be there to see what happened next, because I had choreographed every second of it. Inside the room, Dante was celebrating his ascent to the throne of Reynolds Logistics, holding the transfer document up to the light, admiring his signature as if it were a work of art. Kylie was already calculating how fast she could liquidate the company assets to buy a summer house in the Hamptons. They were drunk on victory, oblivious to the fact that they had just swallowed poison. You can pack up your things and get out of here, Dante told Marcus, his voice booming with arrogance. This company belongs to me now, and tell your client that if she ever sets foot in my building again, I will have her arrested for trespassing. Marcus did not move. He did not look intimidated. He simply adjusted his glasses and opened a thin black folder he had kept set aside on the table. I will certainly file these with the Secretary of State immediately, Marcus said, his voice devoid of emotion. But as the new majority shareholder and CEO, there is one immediate compliance issue you need to address before I leave. Dante laughed, grabbing his suit jacket. I do not have to address anything. I am the boss. I will look at it next week after I fire half the staff. I am afraid this cannot wait. Marcus continued, sliding a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table. It was the current balance sheet. Dante glanced at it dismissively, but then he stopped. He squinted. Then he grabbed the paper, bringing it closer to his face. His eyes darted down the columns, and the blood began to drain from his face faster than water from a cracked vase. What is this? Dante whispered. Why are these numbers in red? Why is there a negative sign in front of the operating capital? That represents the current liabilities of Reynolds Logistics, Marcus explained calmly. As of yesterday, the company is insolvent. It is carrying $10 million in debt to various creditors. The only thing keeping it afloat was Audrey monthly capital injections, which ceased 48 hours ago. Dante's hands began to shake violently. That is impossible, he stammered. The company is worth millions. The brand is worth millions, Marcus corrected. The operational costs are drowning in debt. And if you look at Clause 14, paragraph C of the document you just signed, you will see the provision regarding debt assumption. Dante scrambled for the contract, flipping frantically through the pages he had ignored moments ago. He found the small print. It was right there above his signature, hidden in plain sight. By assuming full ownership, the assignee accepts full personal liability for all outstanding corporate financial obligations. Personal liability. Dante choked out his voice, barely a squeak. That means the debt is no longer shielded by the corporate veil, Marcus said, snapping his briefcase shut. It means the bank can come after your personal assets to satisfy the $10 million. Your house, your car, your savings, and since Mrs. Reynolds also signed it, applies to her assets as well. Congratulations on your acquisition. You are now the sole owner of a $10 million deficit. I will show myself out. It took exactly 3 hours for the audacity to arrive at my doorstep. I was standing in the foyer of the penthouse looking at the city view that Dante had tried and failed to steal when the private elevator chimed. I had not buzzed anyone up, but Kylie had apparently bullied the doorman with her new title of CEO wife to gain access. The steel doors slid open, revealing my sister standing there, flanked by 3 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases. She did not look like a woman who had just won a corporate empire. She looked like a queen demanding a coronation. She breezed past me without a greeting, dropping her handbag on a console table worth more than her car. "This will do," she announced, looking around the living room with a critical eye. "It is a bit modern for my taste, but the view is acceptable. Dante is going to be working late at the office cleaning up the mess you left behind, so I decided to stay here for a few weeks. My doctor said I need absolute quiet and zero stress for the baby's sake. You can take the guest room, Audrey. I will need the master suite because the mattress is likely better for my back." She turned to me, snapping her fingers. "And be a dear and brew me some herbal tea. My throat is parched from all the negotiating we had to do today." I stared at her. The delusion was breathtaking. She truly believed that signing a piece of paper made her the matriarch of the family, and that I had reverted to being her servant. She thought the war was over, and she was the victor coming to claim her spoils. She had no idea she was standing on a landmine. I walked over to the elevator and pressed the call button. The doors, which had just closed, began to reopen. "What are you doing?" Kylie asked, frowning. I said I wanted tea, not an open door. I did not answer. I walked over to her pile of luggage. I grabbed the handle of the largest suitcase and dragged it across the marble floor. Kylie shrieked as I heaved it into the open elevator car, followed immediately by the second and the third. "Hey," she screamed, waddling after me. "Those are vintage. What do you think you are doing?" I turned to face her, blocking her path into my home. "I am doing what I should have done 20 years ago, Kylie. I am taking out the trash." I stepped forward, forcing her to retreat backward into the elevator car to avoid colliding with me. She stumbled over her own bags, looking up at me with a mixture of shock and fury. "You cannot do this," she sputtered. "I am your sister. I own your company." "You own a debt trap," I corrected, leaning in close as the doors began to slide shut. "And this apartment is my sanctuary. It is not a hotel, and it is certainly not a charity for parasites. Get out of my sight before I have security throw you out on the sidewalk." The last thing I saw before the metal doors sealed was her mouth hanging open in silent outrage. She was going down to the lobby, but in reality she was going down much further than that. The courthouse steps looked less like a hall of justice and more like a circus arena. Dante had made sure the media was present in full force. He stood before a bank of microphones, his face a mask of righteous indignation, spinning a tale of how he, a simple, hard-working lawyer, had been duped by his sophisticated billionaire sister-in-law. He claimed I had maliciously tricked him into signing a death warrant disguised as a gift. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was stifling. Dante was suing for fraudulent inducement, seeking to void the contract and force me to assume the $10 million debt he had unwittingly signed his name to. I sat at the defense table next to Marcus, watching the performance. Dante Lawyer was a theatrical man in a cheap suit who used words like predatory and unconscionable to describe my actions. He painted Dante and Kylie as innocent lambs led to the slaughter by a wolf in designer clothing. But the real performance began when the bailiff called the plaintiff first witness. Beatrice rose from the gallery. She had dressed for the part. Gone were the designer dresses and the ostentatious jewelry she had worn to the baby shower. Today she was wearing a faded cardigan and comfortable shoes, looking every bit the frail elderly mother who had been wronged. She walked to the witness stand with a slight limp that I knew for a fact she did not have yesterday. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the clerk asked. "I do," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling just enough to garner sympathy from the jury. Dante Lawyer approached her gently. "Mrs. Reynolds, can you tell the court about your relationship with your daughter Audrey?" Beatrice took a shuddering breath and reached for a tissue. "It has always been difficult," she began. "Audrey was never like her sister. She was always angry, always resentful of our success. We tried to love her. We tried to include her, but she pushed us away." The lawyer nodded, encouraging her. "Did Audrey ever display aggression toward you or your late husband?" Beatrice looked directly at me, her eyes swimming with fake tears. "Yes," she sobbed. "She would scream at her father when he was sick. She refused to help us when we were struggling. She told us she hoped we would lose the house. She said she wanted to see us suffer." A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. The jurors looked from the weeping old woman to me, their expressions hardening. It was a masterpiece of perjury. Every word leaving her mouth was a lie. I had paid for her mortgage. I had paid for my father's medical bills. I had been the only thing standing between them and poverty for a decade. But Beatrice was willing to destroy my character under oath just to help Dante win a lawsuit that would keep the money flowing. I felt Marcus tense beside me, ready to object, but I placed a hand on his arm. "Not yet," I signaled. "Let her finish. Let her put it all on the record. Because the more she lied, the sweeter it would be when I proved that her testimony was not just false, but criminal." I watched my mother weep for a crowd of strangers, and finally accepted that the woman who gave birth to me had died a long time ago. This person on the stand was just a stranger with a script. The courtroom speakers crackled with a burst of static before my own voice filled the high-ceilinged room. It was a recording I had never consented to, and one I recognized immediately despite the heavy editing. The audio was grainy, but the words were unmistakable. "I am not giving you another cent. I do not care if you lose the house. You are on your own. Do not call me again." The silence that followed was heavy and judgmental. The jury looked from the speakers to me, their expressions hardening into disgust. To them, it sounded like the rantings of a heartless daughter abandoning her elderly mother in a time of need. They did not hear the part that had been surgically removed from the beginning of that conversation. They did not hear Dante demanding $50,000 to cover a gambling debt he had incurred in Las Vegas. They did not hear him threatening to burn down my apartment if I did not pay up. All they heard was my refusal stripped of context and presented as cruelty. Dante Lawyer let the silence linger for maximum effect. "As you can hear, Your Honor," he said, his voice grave and solemn. "This is the pattern of behavior we are dealing with. The defendant has a history of financial abuse and emotional abandonment. She cut off her family not because she had to, but because she enjoyed the power it gave her." I felt Marcus stiffen beside me. He began scribbling furiously on his notepad, preparing an objection regarding the chain of custody of the digital file. But I sat perfectly still. I looked up at the bench. Judge Sterling, who had been scrupulously neutral throughout the morning, now looked down at me with a frown that etched deep lines into his forehead. He was swaying. I could see it in the way he set his jaw. He was buying the narrative that I was the villain in this family tragedy. I turned my head slowly toward the plaintiff table. Dante was leaning back in his chair, his face buried in his hands in a pose of theatrical despair, but through his fingers I saw his eyes gleam with triumph. Beside him, Kylie was less subtle. She sat up straighter, shifting so her pregnant belly was the focal point of the room. She placed both hands on her stomach, rubbing it in slow, deliberate circles, while she locked eyes with me. Her lips curled into a smirk that was pure malice. She mouthed the words "got you." She thought she had won. She thought this manipulated recording was the nail in my coffin. She believed that by painting me as a monster, she could distract everyone from the crimes her husband had committed. But she had made a critical error. She assumed that this trial was about my reputation. It was not. It was about the truth. And while they had a doctored recording, I had a witness waiting in the hallway who did not know how to lie. I took a deep breath and let the feeling of injustice wash over me, turning it into fuel. Enjoy your moment, Kylie. It is the last one you will ever have. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, as Marcus stood up, adjusting his tie, with a slow, deliberate calmness that unnerved the prosecution. He did not call me to the stand to defend myself against the manipulated recording. Instead, he turned to the judge and announced our next witness. The defense calls Noah Vance. A ripple of confusion went through the gallery. Dante laughed out loud, a harsh barking sound that echoed off the wood paneling. He stood up, waving his hand dismissively. "This is a joke, Your Honor. The boy is 5 years old. He is not competent to testify. This is just another stunt to garner sympathy." The judge peered over his spectacles, looking from the angry man in the expensive suit to the small boy sitting quietly in the front row, clutching a toy airplane. "I will allow it," the judge ruled, his voice stern. "But I will clear the courtroom of all spectators except the immediate parties to ensure the child is not intimidated." 10 minutes later, the room was empty save for the legal teams and the jury. Noah sat in the witness chair, his legs dangling inches above the floor. He looked small, but he did not look scared. He looked at Ethan, who gave him a reassuring nod, and then he looked at Marcus. Noah, Marcus said softly, kneeling down so he was at eye level with the boy. "You know the difference between the truth and a lie, do you not?" "Yes," Noah chirped, his voice clear and bright. "Lying is bad. Daddy says lying makes your nose grow, but I know that is just a story. But it is still bad." Marcus smiled. "Good. Can you tell the court what you heard when you were in the bathroom stall at the law office the other day? You told your mom and me that you heard Aunt Kylie talking." Noah nodded vigorously. "Yes. She was crying on the phone. She told the doctor that the test said girl, but she needed it to say boy. She said Uncle Dante would be really mad if it was a girl because he needs the money. She said she had to change the paper to trick him." The air was sucked out of the room. I looked at the jury. Their eyes were wide. The entire premise of the forged will which Dante had pinned his hopes on relied on the birth of a male heir. Noah had just revealed that not only was the will a forgery, but the condition for it did not even exist. Kylie's face turned a ghostly shade of white. She slumped in her chair, her hand flying to her mouth. But Noah was not finished. He swung his legs back and forth, innocent of the devastation he was causing. "And then Uncle Dante came in," he continued. "He was yelling at Aunt Kylie. He told her to stop crying. He said he was tired of dealing with Grandma Beatrice. He called her a useful idiot. He said as soon as they got the money, he was going to put the old hag in a nursing home so she would stop begging him for cash." The sound of a gasp cut through the courtroom. It came from the plaintiff table. Beatrice turned slowly to look at Dante. The frailty she had feigned earlier vanished, replaced by a look of pure venomous shock. The alliance was broken. Dante sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land, realizing that his own arrogance and his wife's lies had just been broadcast to a jury by a 5-year-old boy. The cracks in their united front were no longer just hairline fractures. They were canyons, and the ground was about to crumble beneath their feet. Judge Sterling brought the gavel down with a thunderous crack, silencing the murmurs that had erupted after Noah's testimony. The room was vibrating with tension, but I remained calm. Noah had destroyed their moral standing, but I was about to destroy their financial future. I signaled to Marcus, and he nodded, handing me a thick portfolio that had been sitting unopened on our table. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress, and faced the judge. "I am not here to argue about who loves whom, Your Honor," I stated, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. "I am here to discuss the assets of Reynolds Logistics. The plaintiff claims that by hiding my personal wealth, I defrauded the company. But the reality is that the company has been defrauding me for 5 years." Dante scoffed from his seat. You were a receptionist, Audrey. You answered phones. Do not pretend you contributed anything of value. I ignored him and opened the portfolio, extracting a series of large technical blueprints and design sketches. Each one was dated, signed, and notarized. I held up the first one. It was the schematic for the modular shipping container system that was currently the company best-selling product. It accounted for 60% of their annual revenue. Recognize this, Dante? I asked. You should. You launched it 3 years ago. You took all the credit in the trade magazines. You called it a stroke of genius. Dante shifted uncomfortably. So what? You drew it while you were working for us. That is company property. It is called work for hire. Any first-year law student knows that. That would be true, I replied, a cold smile touching my lips if I had been an employee. But as you and my mother have pointed out repeatedly in this courtroom and in the press, I was never on the payroll. I was never issued a paycheck. I was never given a contract. According to your own tax filings, which I have right here, I was classified as an uncompensated family volunteer. I slid the tax documents across the table toward the judge. Because you were too cheap to pay me a salary and too arrogant to give me a contract, I was never legally an employee of Reynolds Logistics. Therefore, under intellectual property law, I am an independent contractor who retains full copyright ownership of all work created. I never assigned those rights to the company. I never signed a transfer agreement. I turned back to Dante, who looked as if he had been punched in the gut. Those designs belong to me. The logo you use belongs to me. The software interface your clients used to track shipments was coded by me. And as of this moment, I am revoking your license to use them. Marcus stood up and handed a formal cease and desist order to the bailiff. Your Honor, we are filing an immediate injunction blocking Reynolds Logistics from manufacturing, selling, or distributing any products based on my client designs. Furthermore, we are countersuing for 5 years of backdated royalties and copyright infringement. Dante's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the judge, then at the papers. He realized the trap too late. He had fought so hard to prove I was nothing to the company that he had inadvertently proved the company owned nothing of mine. He had just acquired a business that I had stripped bare. He owned the factory, but I owned the product. Without my designs, the machines were just scrap metal and the inventory was illegal contraband. He was not just bankrupt. He was obsolete. The silence in the courtroom was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Dante was still clutching the edge of the table, his knuckles white, trying to process the fact that the products he sold were not his. But I was not finished. I reached into the leather portfolio one last time and pulled out the kill shot. These were not just drawings. These were certified registrations from the United States Copyright Office. I laid the documents out in a neat row on the defense table, ensuring the official government seals were visible to the jury. You assumed I was just a naive girl doodling in a sketchbook, I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. You assumed I did not know the value of my own mind. But 5 years ago, before I ever showed these designs to my father, I registered them. Every single line, every single algorithm. I pointed to the date stamp on the first certificate. Look at the date, Dante. It predates your tenure as CEO by 6 months. It predates the launch of the product line. These copyrights are ironclad. And since we have already established that I was never an employee and never signed a licensing agreement, you have been operating in violation of federal law for half a decade. Dante looked at the papers, his eyes bulging. He turned to his lawyer, whispering frantically, but the lawyer pulled away. There was no defense for this. The paper trail was absolute. Marcus stepped forward holding a financial ledger that looked like a weapon. Under the Copyright Act, the penalty for willful infringement is not just a fine, Marcus explained to the judge. It includes the disgorgement of all profits derived from the use of the stolen intellectual property. We have run the numbers based on the tax returns you so kindly provided during discovery. Marcus paused, letting the suspense build before dropping the hammer. Over the last 5 years, Reynolds Logistics generated $25 million in gross revenue from the shipping systems designed by my client. After deducting legitimate operating expenses, The net profit stands at $15 million. The number hung in the air like toxic smoke. $15 million. We are entering a motion for immediate summary judgment, Marcus continued. We are demanding the full repayment of that $15 million to Audrey Vance. And since you just signed a contract assuming full personal liability for the company debts, that money will come from you personally. Kylie let out a strangled sound. She looked at Dante, her eyes wide with horror. She did not know much about business, but she knew they did not have $15 million. They did not even have $1 million. That is insane, Dante shouted, jumping to his feet. We do not have that kind of money. You are bankrupting us. You bankrupted yourself, I replied calmly. You wanted the company, Dante. You wanted the legacy. Well, now you have the bill. You stole my work. You mocked my contribution. You tried to destroy my reputation. Now I am taking back what I built. Every single cent. The judge looked at the copyright certificates, then at Dante's pale, sweating face. He did not need to deliberate long. The evidence was overwhelming. The gavel was raised, and for the first time in his life, Dante Reynolds looked small. He realized he was not fighting a helpless victim. He was fighting the true owner of the empire he had been pretending to rule. The heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a deliberate weight that drew every eye in the room. Ethan stepped through the threshold. He did not walk like a spectator. He walked with the lethal grace of a man who owned the building, the ground it stood on, and the air everyone was breathing. He carried a single thin blue folder. He bypassed the gallery entirely and walked straight through the gate, approaching the bench as a court-appointed forensic observer. Your Honor, Ethan said, his voice deep and resonating off the wood paneling. While my wife has successfully established the ownership of the intellectual property, my team has completed the audit regarding the misappropriation of the corporate funds. We have found where the missing capital went. Dante looked up from the defense table, his face glistening with sweat. He looked like a man who was already drowning and just saw a tidal wave on the horizon. He tried to stand up to object, but his legs seemed to have forgotten how to work. Ethan placed the folder on the judge bench and turned to face the room. The defendant claims the company is insolvent due to poor market conditions. However, the bank records tell a different story. We found a series of recurring withdrawals labeled ambiguous things like client retention and consultant fees. Ethan pulled a single sheet of paper from the file and held it up. This is a credit card statement for the corporate account. Here we see a charge for $5,000 at Tiffany & Company, dated 3 days before the baby shower. And here is a monthly recurring charge for $3,000 for a residential lease on the Lower East Side. He paused, letting the information sink in. He turned his gaze directly to Kylie, who was sitting frozen in her chair, her hands clutching her stomach. Mrs. Reynolds, Ethan said, his voice dropping to a tone of mock sympathy. I notice you are not wearing a new diamond tennis bracelet, and I assume you are not living in a studio apartment occupied by a woman named Vanessa Gold. The name hit the room like a physical blow. Kylie's eyes went wide. She knew that name. Vanessa was the former receptionist at the law firm, the one she had made Dante fire because she was too young and too pretty. Dante scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair over with a loud clatter. That is privileged information, he shrieked, his voice cracking in desperation. You cannot show that. That was for business. She is a consultant. She is your mistress, Ethan corrected, his voice cold and absolute. You stole money from a company that was already failing to fund a lifestyle for a woman who is not your wife. You used the corporate account to pay her rent while you were suing Audrey for failing to support your family. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, but nobody was listening. Kylie let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. She looked at Dante with a hatred so pure it could have peeled the paint off the walls. Dante stood in the center of the storm, looking from the judge to his wife to the mountain of evidence against him. He had lost the company. He had lost the lawsuit. He was $15 million in debt. And now in front of the entire world he had just been exposed as an adulterer who paid for his affair with stolen money. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. There were no lies left to tell. The knockout was total. The eruption that followed was not the organized chaos of a legal objection, but the raw, uncontrolled violence of a domestic tragedy spilling out into the public eye. The realization hit Kylie with the force of a physical blow. The diamonds, the apartment, the late nights at the office. It was not work. It was not stress. It was Vanessa. "You purchased her jewelry!" Kylie screamed, her voice tearing through the dignified air of the courtroom. "I have been wearing costume jewelry for a year because you said we had to economize. You said we were saving for the baby." She did not wait for an answer. She lunged. Kylie threw herself across the short distance between her chair and Dante, clawing at his face with manic desperation. Her fingernails, which were perfectly manicured, raked down his cheek, drawing blood. Dante stumbled back, crashing into the defense table and sending stacks of legal documents flying into the air like confetti. "Get off me, you crazy woman!" Dante yelled, trying to shield his face while pushing her away. He pushed her hard enough that she stumbled back, but she did not stop. She grabbed the heavy water pitcher from the table and hurled it at him. It missed his head by inches, shattering against the wall behind him. The bailiffs were already moving, shouting orders, but the fury of a woman scorned and humiliated in front of the world was a force of nature that could not be easily contained. In the midst of the melee, Beatrice stood up, trembling. She looked at the wreckage of her family. She looked at her son-in-law, who was currently trying to hold his bleeding cheek while dodging his wife blows. She turned to Marcus, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that had nothing to do with the physical violence she was witnessing. "He said he was investing my pension," Beatrice whispered, grabbing Marcus' arm. "Dante told me he needed me to sign a liquidity guarantee for the company last month. He said it was just a formality to release the funds. He said my house was safe." Marcus looked down at her with pity, not for her situation, but for her ignorance. He opened the file again and pointed to a signature page that had been admitted into evidence earlier. "He lied," Marcus said simply. "That was a cross-collateralization agreement, Beatrice. When you signed that, you put up your home and your personal savings as security for the company existing debt. Since Dante just defaulted on those loans and accepted liability, the bank will move to seize your assets as well. You are not just broke, Beatrice. You are homeless." Beatrice looked at Dante, her golden boy, the man she had championed over her own daughter, the man she had conspired with to ruin me. He had not just used me. He had cannibalized her. "Dante," she gasped, her hand clutching her chest. "Tell me it is not true. Tell me you did not gamble away my house." Dante looked up, his hair disheveled, his face bleeding. "Shut up, old woman." He snapped, his veneer completely gone. "You were annoying enough when you had money. Now you are just useless." The color drained from Beatrice's face instantly. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Her knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud. It was not the graceful, theatrical faint she had performed for the cameras at the hospital. This was the heavy, dead weight of a woman whose entire reality had just been pulverized. The bailiffs finally managed to pin Dante to the table, crying out for a medic for Beatrice. I stood in the eye of the storm watching them. My sister screaming in the arms of a guard. My mother unconscious on the floor. My brother-in-law bleeding and bankrupt. The gavel banged repeatedly in the distance, but it sounded like a funeral bell. They had wanted everything I had. Now they had nothing at all. Order was eventually restored, though the scent of fear and betrayal still hung heavy in the air like a fog. Beatrice had been revived by the paramedics, but she refused to leave the courtroom. She sat slumped in a chair against the wall, a shell of a woman watching the proceedings with dead eyes. Kylie was silent now, her rage exhausted, leaving only a hollow terror as she realized the full scope of what was happening. Dante sat alone at the defense table, wiped clean of his arrogance, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that did not exist. Judge Sterling did not waste time with a long preamble. He looked over the rim of his glasses and delivered a judgment that sounded less like a legal ruling and more like a eulogy for the Reynolds family. He granted the summary judgment in my favor on all counts. He affirmed my absolute ownership of the intellectual property and ordered the immediate repayment of the $15 million in stolen profits. But then came the hammer blow that shattered whatever hope they had left. The judge held up the transfer agreement that Dante and Kylie had signed with such glee only hours ago. The court finds that the contract is valid and binding. Judge Sterling stated, his voice echoing in the silent room. By signing this document, Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds assumed full personal liability for the debts of the corporation. Ignorance of the financial state of the company is not a defense against a contract you willingly executed. Therefore, the court orders the immediate seizure of all personal assets belonging to Dante and Kylie Reynolds to satisfy the $10 million debt owed to creditors. Kylie let out a soft whimper. She was doing the math. Her jewelry, her car, the house they lived in, even the designer clothes in her closet. It was all gone. She was not just destitute, she was millions of dollars in the hole. The judge then turned his gaze to Beatrice. Regarding the cross-collateralization agreement signed by Beatrice Reynolds, the court finds no evidence of coercion. You signed a guarantee, Mom. The bank has every right to foreclose on your property to cover the default of your son-in-law. Your assets are hereby frozen pending liquidation. Beatrice did not scream. She simply closed her eyes as the last vestige of her status was stripped away. She was homeless because she had trusted a liar over her own daughter. Finally, Judge Sterling looked at Dante with undisguised disgust. However, this is not merely a civil matter. The evidence presented by Mr. Vance regarding the falsification of business records, the creation of shell companies, and the embezzlement of funds constitutes probable cause for criminal conduct. I am hereby referring this case to the District Attorney Office for immediate investigation into fraud and grand larceny. Bailiffs, please take the defendant into custody. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut was the loudest noise in the room. Dante did not fight. He slumped forward, defeated, as the officers pulled his hands behind his back. He looked at me as they led him away, his eyes pleading for a mercy I did not possess. I stood up and smoothed my dress. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply turned my back on the wreckage of the people who had tried to break me and walked out of the courtroom into the bright, blinding light of my new life. The flashing red and blue lights outside the courthouse painted Dante's face in a grotesque carnival of colors as the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car. The paparazzi he had summoned to document his victory were now documenting his booking. They captured every angle of his humiliation. They zoomed in on his torn suit, his bleeding cheek, and the handcuffs that bound his wrists behind his back. He was screaming about due process and threatening to sue the police department, but nobody was listening. The district attorney had moved fast. With the evidence Ethan provided regarding the embezzlement and the forgery, the charges were not just white-collar crimes. They were felonies carrying mandatory prison time. As the heavy door slammed shut, sealing him inside the cage, Dante looked out the window and saw his reflection in the glass. He did not see a tycoon or a mastermind. He saw a convict. Miles away from the cameras and the courtroom drama, another tragedy was unfolding in the overcrowded maternity ward of County General. Kylie had been denied admission to Mount Sinai after her credit cards were declined, and her insurance was flagged for non-payment. There were no private nurses here. There were no fresh flowers or high thread count sheets. There was only the harsh hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial antiseptic. Kylie gripped the metal rails of the narrow hospital bed, screaming in agony. She was alone. Beatrice was being sedated in a different wing of the hospital after her collapse, and Dante was being processed at central booking. The only person holding Kylie's hand was a stranger, a weary nurse who had been on a double shift and had no patience for the entitled woman demanding mineral water and a foot massage between contractions. "Where is my husband?" Kylie shrieked, her face contorted with pain and rage. "Call him. Tell him I am having his son. He needs to be here." The nurse did not look up from the monitor. "Your husband is not answering, ma'am. Now push." Kylie sobbed. She pushed with the last reserves of her strength, driven not by maternal instinct, but by a desperate need to salvage something from the wreckage of her life. She believed that if she produced a son, she could still fight. She could claim the baby was the heir to the Reynolds legacy, even if the money was gone. She clung to the lie she had told Dante, hoping against hope that biology would bend to her will. One final scream tore from her throat, and then the room was filled with the thin, high-pitched wail of a newborn. The nurse lifted the infant, wiping it down with a rough towel before placing it on Kylie's chest. The baby was small and red, squalling with life. Kylie looked down frantically, ignoring the baby face and checking immediately for the one thing that mattered to her. "It is a boy, right?" she gasped, grasping the nurse's arm. "Tell me it is a boy." The nurse pulled Kylie's hand away gently but firmly. "No, honey. Congratulations. It is a beautiful baby girl." Kylie froze. She stared at the child in her arms with a look of absolute horror. A girl. Noah had been right. The doctors had been right. All the lying, all the scheming, all the forgery had been for nothing. There was no male heir. There was no trust fund. There was no legacy. "Take it away," Kylie whispered, turning her head to the wall. "I do not want it." The nurse looked at her with disgust and picked up the crying infant, cradling her close. The baby cries echoed in the hollow room, a mournful sound that marked the end of the Reynolds dynasty. They had sacrificed everything for a crown that did not exist. The rain was falling in sheets, turning the city gray and cold, but it felt appropriate for the final funeral of my past. I stepped out of the lobby of my building, flanked by security, but I signaled them to hang back when I saw the figure waiting by the curb. It was Beatrice. She was unrecognizable. The designer suits and the aura of invincibility were gone, replaced by a wet trench coat that had seen better days. Her hair, usually lacquered into a helmet of perfection, was plastered to her skull. She looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own making. When she saw me, she did not sneer. She did not command. She ran forward and threw herself onto the wet pavement at my feet. It was a display of abasement so total it was almost hard to watch. She clutched the hem of my coat, her knuckles white dirt streaking her hands. "Audrey, please!" she wailed, her voice cracking with a desperation I had never heard before. "You cannot let them take it. They posted the eviction notice this morning. They are giving me 48 hours to vacate. It is your father's house, Audrey. It is the only thing I have left of him. Please, I am begging you. Just write a check. It is nothing to you, but it is everything to me. I will do anything. I will disappear. Just save the house." I looked down at the woman who had made my life a misery for 30 years. I searched for a flicker of pity in my heart, but I found only a vast Arctic silence. She was not crying for me. She was not sorry for the pain she had caused or the lies she had told in court. She was crying for the loss of her status. Even now on her knees, she was calculating. She was trying to use my father's memory as a lever to pry open my wallet one last time. I reached down and peeled her fingers off my coat one by one. I did not help her stand. I let her stay on the ground where she had chosen to be. "You do not get to talk about him," I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the rain like a razor. "You lost the right to that house the moment you signed it away to cover Dante gambling debts. You did not value it then as a home. You valued it as a poker chip. You sold the roof over your head to buy a lottery ticket for a son-in-law who hated you." Beatrice looked up, mascara running down her face. "But I am your mother," she whispered. "I raised you." I shook my head slowly. "No, you were just a landlord, Beatrice, and a terrible one at that. You evicted me from your heart when I was a child because I did not make you rich. Now the bank is returning the favor. That house belongs to the bank now, just like your loyalty belonged to whoever had the most money. I do not pay the debts of strangers." I stepped around her and opened the door of the waiting limousine. She tried to lunge for the handle, screaming my name, scrambling on the wet concrete, but I slid into the warm leather seat and pulled the heavy door shut with a final decisive slam. The sound was the period at the end of a very long sentence. As the car pulled away, I watched her shrinking in the rearview mirror, a small wet figure screaming at the taillights. I turned my head forward and told the driver to drive. The Pacific Ocean stretched out before me, a vast expanse of turquoise glass that seemed to wash away the grime of the last few months. Here in Malibu, the air smelled of salt and wild sage, not courtrooms and desperation. I sat on the teak deck of the beach house, watching Noah chase seagulls near the waterline, his laughter carried on the breeze. He was building a sandcastle, a sprawling fortress that he insisted was impenetrable. Ethan sat beside me, one hand resting casually on my knee, his other holding a cold drink. He looked relaxed, the tension of the city finally melting from his shoulders. We were miles away from the wreckage of the Reynolds family, but their shadow had lingered until this very moment. My phone vibrated on the table. It was a single notification from Marcus, but it carried the weight of a final verdict. I picked it up, shielding the screen from the glare of the sun. It was the confirmation of the bankruptcy auction results. With Dante in prison and the family assets seized, the liquidation of Reynolds Logistics had been swift and brutal. Because I held the intellectual property rights and had blocked the use of the designs, no legitimate buyer wanted to touch the company. It was a toxic asset, a shell with no engine. Except for me. I looked at the final purchase price. It was laughable. I had acquired the entire infrastructure of the company, the factories, the trucks, the warehouses for pennies on the dollar. It was less than the cost of the wedding reception Kylie had thrown for herself. I tapped the screen, opening the digital portal to the Secretary of State office. The final step was waiting. The cursor blinked in the box labeled Entity Name. I typed slowly, enjoying every keystroke. I backspaced over Reynolds Logistics, erasing my father name, erasing Dante, legacy, erasing the monument to greed that had almost destroyed me. In its place, I typed a new name. A name that belonged only to me. AV Global. Done. I locked the phone and set it face down on the table. The Reynolds empire was dead. I had bought its bones, and I would build something new on top of them, something that would never be touched by their poison again. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked, squeezing my knee gently. "Better than okay," I replied, looking out at the ocean. "I just bought the company back. It cost me next to nothing. And I changed the name." Ethan smiled, a genuine expression of pride that made my chest warm. "It is finally over then." "Yes," I said, taking a deep breath of the clean ocean air. "It is finally over." Noah ran up to the deck, breathless and beaming, holding out a pristine white seashell he had found in the surf. "Look, Mommy," he shouted. "I found the best one. It is for you." I took the shell, turning it over in my hands. It was perfect. I looked at my son, who was safe and loved. I looked at my husband, who had stood by me when the world was burning. And then I looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip, turning the water into liquid gold. I thought of Beatrice standing in the rain. I thought of Dante in his cell. I thought of Kylie alone in that hospital. They had chased an illusion of wealth and lost their souls. I had walked through the fire and found something real. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely light. I was not a daughter. I was not a sister. I was not a victim. I was Audrey Vance. I was the owner of my own life. And as I opened my eyes and watched the sun set over my ocean, I smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had won the only war that mattered. The saga of Audrey Vance serves as a brutal yet beautiful reminder that true power does not reside in status, inheritance, or the projection of wealth, but in the quiet fortress of integrity and self-worth. Beatrice, Dante, and Kylie spent their lives chasing the mirage of success. They believed that wealth was an entitlement, and that family was merely a resource to be exploited. Their downfall was not caused by Audrey's malice, but by their own catastrophic underestimation of the person they abused. They built their empire on the shifting sands of lies, forgery, and betrayal, believing that arrogance could substitute for competence. Conversely, Audrey's victory illustrates that the ultimate weapon against toxicity is not emotional retaliation, but strategic competence and ownership. She did not win by screaming louder. She won by owning her intellectual property, understanding the law, and allowing her enemies to destroy themselves through their own unbridled greed. The story teaches us that toxic loyalty is a debt trap. Walking away from family members who view you as a servant or a bank account is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary act of survival. Furthermore, the narrative highlights the terrifying efficiency of the law of consequences. Dante's downfall wasn't just bad luck, it was the mathematical result of his character flaws. He signed his own death warrant because he was too greedy to read the fine print. In the end, Audrey proved that you cannot buy class, you cannot fake a legacy, and the truth is the only currency that never devalues. If you enjoyed this story of justice, resilience, and sweet revenge, please like and subscribe to our channel to catch the next dramatic series.